Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you live from my backyard in Los Angeles, California. How's everyone doing today? I hope you're well, I hope you're happy, healthy, and having some fun. Today is World Chimpanzee Day, which I found out about when I woke up this morning. I did not know it ahead of time, but it works really well because yesterday we talked about what is largely regarded the most intelligent of all species of monkeys, with capuchin monkeys. Today we're going to talk about chimpanzees, and in some ways people consider chimpanzees to also be the most intelligent of the non-human apes in regards to their tool use. They use tools more regularly than the other apes do, and they have the most complex social dynamics. That being said, some of the others have proven some really amazing things in problem solving. So I'm not going to argue primate intelligence, but I am going to talk a bit about chimpanzees. Now, the reason today is World Chimpanzees Day is because 60 years ago, on July 14th, 1960, a very, very important scientist by the name of Jane Goodall arrived in Gombe National Preserve at the time, in what is now called Tanzania. That began her fieldwork studies, studying chimpanzees. And she is world-renowned primatologist who has really kind of changed the way we look at animals, and has also changed the way we protect and preserve the natural world. She's a very accomplished scientist, field researcher, and humanitarian. She's one of my heroes for sure. We'll talk a little bit more about Dr. Jane a little bit later. But 60 years ago, she was 26 years old. Today she is 86 years old, and she is still going strong, doing a lot of work. She was very passionate about learning more about chimpanzees because at that time we did not know much about them, and through her work and through her observations and studies, we've learned a lot. Chimpanzees are very social, more so than the other great apes of orangutans and gorillas and bonobos. They typically live in very dynamic and large groups. Those groups can sometimes number up to about 100 individuals, but they break up into smaller groups, sometimes to go look for food, sometimes for a couple of days, sometimes to rest and relax. And then they come back together as a bigger group again. That organization is called fission and fusion. Imagine it like your very closest group of friends, but then sometimes you hang out in a bigger group of friends, but sometimes you go back to just the closer group of friends. Or same with like your family. You have your immediate family, and then you have your extended family, like with grandmas and grandpas and aunts and uncles and cousins. And sometimes you're with the whole group, and sometimes you're just with a small group. But chimpanzees do that very, very well. And it's pretty crazy and pretty dynamic sometimes to watch some of those interactions and some of the ways that they manipulate and control their social groups. Chimpanzees live across the middle of Africa, in Central Africa, and they go all the way to the very far western edge in a little country called Senegal. That's right on the edge of the big curve of Africa, on the Atlantic Ocean. And from there, they live in a very large band, kind of broken up in a couple places, missing actually in a couple of countries where they used to live, and all the way east to the countries of Uganda and Tanzania. With that, there are 4 different subspecies of chimpanzees, and between 2 of those subspecies, there's some chimps that live in that middle area. They don't know which one they belong to, or if by chance there might be a 5th subspecies. So we're still learning more about chimps. Throughout those different ranges, chimpanzees live in a variety of different habitats. So mostly it's tropical forest through most of that range of Africa. But sometimes it's dry forest, and it only has rainfall during seasons of the year, and it's dry the rest. Sometimes it's forest on the edges of mountains, and they can live up to higher elevations. I think the highest elevation for chimpanzees is probably around 8,000 feet, but that's still pretty good considering they also go down as low as the coast. So quite a bit of variety in the forest that they live in. And in some places they actually live in an area that they call the savanna woodlands. This is kind of the same habitat that giraffes use, where there's trees but also grassland, and the trees are kind of sporadic and around that area. And the chimps in those areas actually live quite a bit differently than their family and friends that may live more in a tropical setting. In 1900, it was estimated that there were about 1 million chimpanzees. And although of all the great apes, they have the biggest range and they still have the best population, that is dramatically decreased since that time, with the highest estimates today being around 350,000 individuals. So they definitely have decreased a lot during the last 120 years. Chimps are about the size of smaller humans. So they stand between 3.5 and up to about 5 feet tall when they stand upright, which they can do, and they can walk upright. They have been observed walking upright sometimes for as far as a mile, but it is a little rare. They typically walk more on all fours, using the knuckles of their hands to walk on the front part, flat-footed on the back. They call that knuckle walking. Their arms are also much longer than their legs. That's pretty obvious if you watch chimpanzees for a bit. When they sit, they typically sit kind of hunched with their knees bent and their feet planted on the ground. But otherwise, they kind of really resemble humans in a lot of ways. And there's a really good reason for that. They share over 98% of our same genetics. I remember going to a museum, and I think I have a photo, and if so, I'll post it later today. But in this museum, there was a human skeleton next to a chimpanzee skeleton of toddlers, like 3 years old. And the difference was very, very minor. And next to that, they had a skeleton of a human adult next to a skeleton of a chimpanzee adult. The differences there were a little more noticeable, but it was really interesting to be able to compare and contrast the differences between those specimens in a museum setting. I'll see if I have that photo. If not, I'll see if I can Google it to show you later. It was really crazy to be able to see that. Chimpanzees, when they live in these large groups that are fission-fusion, it's multiple males and multiple females, and it's multi-generational. So that is definitely like grandparents, parents, offspring, and then aunts and uncles factor in, and sometimes it's completely unrelated individuals that also live very closely with related individuals. That's quite a bit different than any of the other great apes. They typically live in a family group where they're all related, and where there's like a dominant male and his 2 or 3 females that he breeds with, and then their offspring. In the case of gorillas or orangutans, pretty much live alone. So chimpanzees live in a much more dynamic social world. With that, they have more advanced communication than the other great ape species. They've identified 34 different vocalizations. The most common are screams, hoots, and grunts. And if you've ever been near chimpanzees in like a zoo setting, you have probably heard some of those sounds. They are not quiet. They're very loud and very vocal. When a female chimpanzee gets pregnant, her pregnancy or gestation period is about 7.5 to 8 months, so not that far different from humans. When the babies are born, they're about 4 pounds, so that is a little different, a bit smaller than the average human baby, but it's pretty helpless. It can't do anything on its own for quite a while, and so it holds on to its mom's chest, and she often holds it with one arm, nursing it and caring for it and carrying it on her chest for about 6 months. Then as it gets a little bigger, a little stronger, it moves to her back, and it holds on to her back as they move throughout their forest home looking for food. Once it's about a year or two old, it will kind of hop on and off of her back for another 2 or 3 years. Sometimes still catching a ride if possible when it's about 4 years old. I have a couple nieces and nephews who were similar in that they always wanted to be picked up and carried when we'd go places. So I understand that that is also fairly similar to some human behavior. Baby chimps will stay really close to their mom's side until they're at least about 7 or 8 years old, and then they'll kind of start to wander off a little bit more. Typically by the time they're like 10 or 12, female chimps leave their group that they grew up in. That's also different than a lot of other animals. Usually the females stay and it's the males who leave. But with chimpanzees, the males stay, the females move out. And so they'll go find another chimpanzee troop kind of in their early teens. And then they will usually have their first baby at around age 13 or 14, although male chimps usually don't father a baby until they're a bit older, like 15 or 16 years old. When they're toddlers, play is super important. They'll play with other baby chimps in their troop, in their family. And through that, they really begin to explore their world. And they will watch the adults and try to observe and mimic a lot of those behaviors. With the research of Dr. Jane Goodall that she did in Tanzania, living amongst the wild chimpanzees, it was first documented through her research that they used tools. And the first tool use that she observed was using a lawn stick or sometimes a blade of grass to dip into termite mounds to get bugs out and then lick those off of the grass and then stick the grass back in. That was her first observation of tool use in chimpanzees. And when she released that, it changed the world, really. Most people had always defined humans as being the only ones smart enough to use a tool. And the animals didn't ever do that. And when Jane Goodall released her research, including photos of chimpanzees using tools, it really shook up the scientific world and made them have to rethink the way we view animals and the way we view animal intelligence. Her research further described other tool uses, including using stones to crush nuts and using leaves to soak up water. They would also later observe that chimpanzees would eat certain types of plants or use certain plants as medicine. And if any of this sounds anything familiar, we actually talked a bit about this yesterday, talking about capuchin monkeys in South America that do many of the same things. And if you saw any of the videos I posted on Facebook yesterday, there were well-documented instances of capuchin monkeys in South America doing most of those same things. So that research all came much later. Chimpanzees were the first non-humans to be documented using tools. We now know that there's several different animals who use tools. And if you remember back to when we talked about crows and ravens last week, it can be argued that they use tools as well. So it's not just mammals. Some birds do it too. Chimpanzees, like I said, have very broad communication with a bunch of vocalizations, but they also communicate through a lot of gestures, body language, and facial expressions. Some of those include things that also Dr. Jane Goodall first described, including drumming on trees and kind of their rally cry before they either go hunting or if they're going to have a fight with a neighboring group of chimpanzees. If you've ever seen any of that footage, it is a little intense, a little scary, and can sometimes leave you with a feeling of uneasiness and maybe even fear for chimpanzees. When Jane Goodall experienced those things, she was just in awe. She was in wonder. She was never scared. And she really helped change the way that scientists do a lot of field observations. Because she didn't just sit back and watch, but she got herself involved to where she could interact with some of them, and she was accepted among them, and was allowed to see some chimpanzee behaviors that had never been documented before. Also very important for chimpanzees is grooming. This is a way to reaffirm social bonds. Typically, only chimps who are very friendly with each other will groom each other, but they will sometimes involve grooming to kind of force their political perspective. Kind of like, I'll do this favor for you, but then you do this favor for me later on. And it can become quite dynamic in a group of chimpanzees to see who is playing favorites with who, including their grooming. Chimpanzees are also incredible nest builders. That is common across most great apes. They usually build a nest to sleep in at night. With chimpanzees, that is up in the trees. They spend a lot of their time up in the trees at night to sleep. They're a little safer there from potential predators like leopards who hunt at night. And they're also just kind of out of the way of anything else going on the forest floor. They're probably going to sleep a little better up in the trees. So they're excellent climbers. They do spend time in the trees and sometimes are up in the trees looking for food. However, if they're going to travel, they usually come down to the ground and walk across the ground and then go up another group of trees rather than trying to move tree to tree to tree. Part of that is because they are pretty big. We talked about how high they are. I think I skipped over their weights. They can weigh between 70 and 150 pounds. And that sometimes can be a lot of weight to try to move through small branches on trees high up in the forest. And they're gonna probably come back down to move around a little more. Chimpanzees are also omnivores. That means they eat a little bit of everything. In the tropical forest, they tend to eat more fruit than the chimps who live in maybe some of those drier forests, or in that savanna woodlands area, they tend to eat more insects. But they definitely do hunt other animals. They'll go after birds and bird eggs, and occasionally they will hunt things like squirrels, monkeys, and small forest-dwelling antelopes. They usually just the males of the family group go hunting, and then they sometimes share the food, sometimes they don't. So typically if they catch something pretty big, it gets broken down into enough pieces that everybody gets a taste, but most of the meat is then consumed by the males who participated in the hunt. It's been documented in most troops that they eat over 80 different food items, and in some troops it's been hundreds of different food items. So they definitely have a lot of variety in the foods that they eat. They can live to be about 40 years old in the wild. In captive situations like zoos, they sometimes live into their 50s. A few individuals have lived even longer than that. There's a few reports of some living up until almost 80, although those are usually few and far between. With chimpanzees, many of their emotions, which were also described by Jane Goodall, are very similar to humans, including things like self-recognition. They know who they are when they see their own reflection. They're also very curious. They exhibit sympathy, grief, and deception. So like people, they have a wide range of emotions. They also have a variety of personalities, and that was also first described by Dr. Goodall and highly questioned by the larger science community, because personalities was again something attributed to only humans at that time. And through her research, she really helped us understand that the line between humans and animals is a lot more thin and a lot more blurred than previously thought. Since then, they've done genetic testing, and 98% of our genes are shared with chimpanzees. Now, there is another animal called the bonobo that is sometimes called the pygmy chimpanzee. For many years, it was classified as a chimpanzee, and genetically, it is very, very closely related to them, but it is also very closely related to us. I'll be talking about bonobos in a future episode of Critter Chat. With chimpanzees, they are endangered. In one of the subspecies is listed as critically endangered because their forest is disappearing at a very large rate. The three main threats to chimpanzees are poaching, so they are hunted, Sometimes they are hunted, the adults are killed for meat, and the babies are then captured and sold as pets. The pet trade and the entertainment industry have used chimpanzees for a very long time. Also, for many years, chimpanzees were used in research in medical situations and tested for medical things, behavioral things, mental cognition. They were used in labs around the world for many, many years. Most of those have since ceased, but there is some that still live in a lab environment. For a baby chimpanzee who becomes a pet, that is usually a very big struggle of that individual's life. They typically can live with humans during their young years, but once they reach maturity, so again with females that's about 13, 14, with males it's 15, 16, things change quite a bit and they start looking more for members of their own species, and they usually act very aggressively. There are numerous accounts of people who have had chimpanzees as pets where it ended very tragically, sometimes for the people, sometimes for the chimpanzee, oftentimes for both. So again, we talked about primates as pets a bit yesterday, and I am very much against that. I posted a post on Facebook that explains why, and many reasons include the aggressive nature, their lack of social abilities that people can provide, and they can be very destructive and dangerous. The second big reason for chimp endangerment is habitat loss. Their forests are being cut down at an alarming rate, particularly in kind of the middle area of their zone. The country of Nigeria is a country with a huge human population, as are some of the other countries nearby. Some of those countries have also experienced a lot of war and political issues, bad economic issues where the people are very poor and impoverished. And when all of those things come together, it is usually very hard on any animals that live in the area. They are sometimes killed and eaten. They are sometimes captured and sold. Whatever they can do for the people to try to get some money or to somehow make a living. Also, in parts of their habitat, the trees are being cut down and used for lumber, or also being cut down to then use the land to grow crops. That is very common in forested areas around the world. Africa is no exception to that. And a major mineral that is used to make cell phones called coltan is mined in a lot of those tropical forests in Africa. An easy way you can help out is when you're wanting to get a new cell phone, recycle your old cell phone. There's a lot of options of ways you can do that. Sometimes through the company you buy your new cell phone from. Also, if you live near a major US zoo, they usually do cell phone recycling at the zoo. You can drop it off. The zoo will get it recycled to the right people. They will reuse that same mineral instead of mining more coltan to make more cell phones. And with that, the zoo also gets a little money from turning in the cell phones, which helps out the zoos to fund their other programs. The third big threat for chimpanzee endangerment is disease. Because they are so close to us genetically, many of the diseases that we have also impact chimpanzees. And many diseases get transferred between the two species quite often. Particularly at risk with chimpanzees right now is Ebola. Ebola has caused thousands of chimpanzee and gorilla deaths in Africa in the last 40 years. They assume that it's going to continue to cause some issues there, and growing populations of humans and humans impacting chimpanzee habitat continues to kind of spread that disease back and forth. So if a human with Ebola has it, they can pass it on to the forest into where chimps live. It runs through the chimp population, and then when more people visit the forest, the chimps can sometimes pass it back to the people. And it just keeps cycling back and forth. Other diseases, that is well documented in as well. I want to talk a little bit about my experience with chimpanzees. I have limited experience, but during my days training to be a zookeeper at the Los Angeles Zoo, I did work several times with the chimpanzee keepers during my training volunteer days. It was always a little bit scary because I'm a little terrified of chimpanzees, more so than the other apes. I've worked with orangutans and gorillas quite a bit and was never really too scared of them. I was always scared of the chimps. Just because chimpanzees have kind of a longer history of aggressive behavior with people, and sometimes that can be very scary. They're also very loud, and they know if they're loud they can scare you and then you drop things and they think that's funny, or they can scare you and you drop food and then they get more food. So all sorts of things can go on there. But in working with chimps, I did gain a huge amount of respect for them and for the people who work with them on a regular basis. It was amazing to me how easily the keepers who worked with them regularly could identify individuals, because looking at chimpanzees, you first think that they all look the same. And once you start to really look at them, you recognize differences in their face shape, in their hair shape, in their coloration, in their mannerisms, in their personality, in who is sitting next to who, of what sounds they make, of how that sound sounds. They actually have different voices, and you can often recognize, well, I can't, you can't, but the keepers who work with them can recognize individual voices, and it's really amazing. The Los Angeles Zoo, although they've been closed for coronavirus since the middle of March, announced today that they have 2 new chimpanzees who have recently joined their troop from the Tulsa Zoo, giving them a total of 16 chimpanzees who live in their habitat, and making them once again the largest chimpanzee troop in the United States in an accredited zoo where the chimps all live together. It's really remarkable. They have multiple males, multiple females. They have a great exhibit that allows them to do that fission and fusion break-off, like I talked about a little bit earlier, where smaller groups can go in different places and then they can kind of have some alone time in those smaller groups, but then they can also all come together into a big group. I'll be sharing some information from the LA Zoo a little later on the Facebook page, so watch for that. Our special shout out today is to the Jane Goodall Institute. That is her nonprofit organization. She started it in 1976. And when she did, she kind of really changed the way that people worked in doing any sort of conservation and education. She realized that she had learned a lot about chimpanzees, but if she didn't then do something with what she had learned, they would probably become extinct at a faster rate. And it's because of her work and her inspiring thousands, if not millions of people around the world to do a little more and do a little better. She has really changed the face of conservation, and she is still doing some amazing work today. In 1986, she officially left her research station in Tanzania to become more of an advocate on the public speaking conservationist fundraising side of things, where she travels the world as an expert in primatology and conservation. She still maintains a property in Tanzania, and as she was at her home in 1991, she was working with some of the local children who lived in the area, and an idea came to her to start a new program called the Roots and Shoots. It started with 12 kids in Tanzania, and it's now a program that millions of children are involved in throughout 65 different countries in the world. She is truly a great inspiration, a conservation hero, a humanitarian, and someone we can all look up to as inspiration to do a little more and make a difference with what we have, where we are. If we all do that a little bit more, the planet in general can be a bit better. I'll be sharing some amazing things about Dr. Jane Goodall later today as well, so check that out. As always, be happy, be healthy, have fun. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.